Hi, welcome to YoPop Prep's review of the 55 multiple choice questions from the College Board's only released full-length AP US History exam. Hopefully, most of you have already taken this test either as part of your APUSH class or on your own to prep for the real deal in May. If you haven't taken it yet, I strongly recommend you stop this video and come back after you're done it. Trust me, it will be much more useful and easier to follow once you actually wrestle with the questions yourself. Alright, so what are we doing in this video? My goal is to help you use what you already know about US history and then streamline your thought process by showing you how to connect the dots in how the test is structured. Along the way, I also want to give you a big picture view of American history because the best students don't just memorize facts, they understand the flow of history. To do that, we'll keep coming back to four major turning points. If you're taking notes, jot this down: 1776, 1865, 1929, and 1945. First, 1776. That's the year the Declaration of Independence was signed. So why did the American colonists want to break away from the British Empire? Just remember the phrase, no taxation without representation. In other words, they didn't want to be told to pay taxes without having any say in the government that taxed them. You should also remember another famous line: all men are created equal. But let's be clear, in 1776, that didn't mean everyone. Still, the founding fathers were deeply inspired by Enlightenment ideas like natural rights, liberty, and democracy. And anything before 1776, that period is mostly about European colonists coming to America, sometimes for religious freedom, but more often for economic opportunity, just like it has been for almost everyone who came to this country throughout US history, from your ancestors to my family. Next, 1865. That's when the Civil War ended. If a passage or question falls between 1776 and 1865, here's how to think about it. If the period is roughly 25 years after 1776, the stimulus and questions are likely about defining the role of the federal government. If the period is roughly 25 years before 1865, the focus will likely be on rising tensions between the North and South, especially over slavery, states' rights, and economic differences. If the period falls between 1800 and 1840, the stimulus and questions will probably deal with Western expansion, especially following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and with the U.S. asserting itself as a sovereign nation that demanded respect from European powers after World War of 1812, which ended in a stalemate with the mighty British Empire. Why is 1865 so important? Although the Industrial Revolution began to influence the nation in the 1840s, the US didn't fully enter it until after the Civil War. Once the war was over, the country went full throttle into modernization, railroads, factories, big businesses, and all that jazz. Just 4 years after the Civil War, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, nearly 2,000 miles long, built in just 6 years, mostly by Chinese and Irish immigrants under brutal conditions. Between 1865 and 1930, over 30 million immigrants arrived from Ireland, Italy, Germany, Eastern Europe, China, and Japan. By 1920, the U.S. population had more than tripled since the Civil War, from 31 million to over 105 million people. But while the wealthy elite thrived during what we call the Gilded Age, most Americans didn't. Men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan built monopolies and became billionaires. The U.S. became the world's leading industrial power. However, workers labor in unsafe factories for low wages. Child labor was rampant. That led to labor unrest and the Progressive Era, where reformers tried to fix the system. Journalists like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell exposed corruption and greed. Laws were passed for antitrust regulation, child labor bans, and the direct election of senators. And countless activists led the fight for women's suffrage, which finally succeeded with the 19th Amendment in 1920. By the 1920s, America looked modern, industrial, democratic, and powerful. That's why we call it the Roaring Twenties. Everything was going great until it wasn't. Before we get to the Great Depression, there's one more turning point we can skip, World War One. The US stayed neutral at first, but in 1917, Germany U-boat attacks and the Zimmermann telegraph pushed President Woodrow Wilson to declare war, not just to win, but to make the world safe for democracy. At home, the government ramped up production, used propaganda to build support, and passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which jailed critics of the war. So we fought for freedom abroad, we restricted at home. Third, 1929, the year of the stock market crash and start of the Great Depression. The economy tanked. Millions were unemployed. In response, FDR launched the New Deal, a wave of government programs that created jobs, modernized infrastructure, and built a social safety net. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office with bold promise, a new deal for the American people. It wasn't one program, it was dozens. The CCC and WPA hired millions to build roads, schools, dams, bridges, the bones of modern infrastructure. The FDIC insured your bank deposits. The SEC regulated Wall Street. Social Security provided pension for the elderly and unemployment insurance. And most importantly, the federal government took responsibility for the economic welfare of the people. The New Deal modernized the U.S. in a way no program ever had. Public housing, public electricity, public education, rural electrification and TVA dams, labor protection, collective bargaining, and the minimum wage. It shifted the national mindset from you're on your own to government can and should step in when markets fail. But recovery was slow, and it wasn't until World War II that the economy fully bounced back. And finally, 1945. The US officially entered World War II in 1941, and the war ended in 1945. During the war, the US mobilized like never before. Men went overseas to fight, and women entered the workforce in droves. But 1945 wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. The US emerged from World War II ready to shape the modern world. The US helped create the United Nations, World Bank, and IMF. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college and helped build the modern middle class. Suburbs exploded, car culture took off, and consumerism reigned. When the war was over, the US emerged as a global superpower, but quickly turned its attention to stop the spread of communism. This set the stage for the Cold War, including conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and rising tension with the Soviet Union. On the domestic front, the civil rights movement became a key topic whenever you're dealing with events that happened after 1945. If you can keep these four dates in mind, 1776, 1865, 1929, 1945, you have a solid framework for almost every stimulus and every question. Now, let's go over a few quick strategies before we dive into the questions. First, don't read the full stimulus right away. Instead, focus on the source information or attribution, that little blurb that tells you who wrote it and when. It often gives you just enough context to predict what the correct answer should look like. Save time and focus your brain power where it matters most. Second, don't rush to pick the right answer. Start by eliminating the wrong ones using what you already know. Process of elimination is your best friend on this test. Third, look for connections. If you think about it, it's pretty clear that multiple choice questions are often tied to the same stimulus or even share similar answer choices. Use that to your advantage. Bonus tip. If you spot two answer choices that are direct opposites, chances are one of them is correct. That's a classic multiple choice trick, and it works more often than you think. One last reminder. Remember, on any multiple choice test, working efficiently through the question is essential. Don't waste time reading the stimulus unless you absolutely have to. Assume the excerpts are there to slow you down. So spend as little time on them as possible and invest your focus on reading the questions and answer choices very thoroughly. Scoring reminder. It's important to remember that you only need to get about 75% of the multiple choice questions right to earn a 5, assuming you did correspondingly well on the essay portion of the exam. If you're aiming for a 4, the threshold is even lower, around 65%, again, assuming you held your own on the essays. So don't get bogged down by a few difficult questions and miss the chance to answer easier ones that could help you reach your desired score. All right, let's get started with working through these questions together. Unfortunately for question 1 to 3, despite what I said about not reading the stimulus, you need to do some reading to get them right. But even here, you can still eliminate a couple of answer choices just by reading the questions carefully. For question 1, you can eliminate choice A, Roman Catholic influence, because Whitfield was a Protestant preacher from Ireland. That rules out any connections to Catholicism. Correct choice is C, transatlantic exchanges, because Whitfield had to cross the Atlantic Ocean to reach the British colonies. His impact is a perfect example of religious ideas moving across the ocean and influencing colonial culture. For question 2, zero in on the phrase open air preaching in the question. That tells you something about breaking from traditional religious structures. Then, from the passage, look at the line multitudes of all sects and denominations that attend his sermons. That points to greater independence and diversity of thought, which is why B is the correct choice. For question 3, it helps to think about why Reverend Whitfield was in the colonies in the first place, to preach. The question asks what his preaching represents historically. The answer is pretty straightforward. D. The expansion of Protestant evangelism. That's exactly what was happening during the First Great Awakening, and Whitfield was one of its biggest figures. Question 4 to 6. Title of the graph: Migration to the United States 1820-1860 is a helpful clue. It allows you to eliminate several answer choices and make educated guesses based on timing and context. Question 4. pay close attention to the date mentioned in the question, 1843 to 1854. You can eliminate choice A and C because the US government wasn't actively encouraging migration at the time. In fact, the country was dealing with the rising tension between the North and South, especially over the issue of slavery. Choice D, adoption of free trade policies, doesn't explain why people would leave and move to the United States. That leaves B as the correct answer. Economic and political difficulties in Germany and Ireland. If you remember from AP World History, Ireland experienced the Great Famine from 1845 to 1852, and Germany faced political upheaval, particularly during the failed revolution of 1848. These were major push factors driving migration. Question 5. The question focused on the trend in immigration after 1845. You should notice from the graph that immigration peaked around 1855. Many of those immigrants were Irish who were English speaking but Catholic and had different customs and accents that stood out. This led to a strong nativist backlash, anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment, which fueled movements like the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s. So the correct answer is C, the upsurge in nativist sentiment. You can also eliminate A, B, and D because that would have actually discouraged immigration or don't directly relate to this wave of migrants. A, an increased sectional tension has more to do with slavery. A major economic downturn doesn't apply here. Immigrants were coming despite tough conditions. The collapse of the second party system came later and was more about slavery than immigration. Question 6. To answer this one, ask yourself, why were so many people coming to the US during this time? The obvious answer? They were looking for better opportunities, especially jobs. You can safely eliminate A, the convergence of European and American culture, which is vague and not really related to this immigration trend. C, the displacement of American Indians from the Southeast, which happened mostly in the 1830s and isn't tied to the immigration. D, the resurgence of evangelical Protestantism doesn't match either, especially since many immigrants like the Irish were Catholic, not Protestant. That leaves B as the best answer, the emergence of an industrialized economy. If you remember, the North was industrializing rapidly during this period with factories, railroads, and wage labor, while the South remained largely agricultural, leading to increasing tensions, as we discussed earlier. Immigrants flocked to the North to fill those factory and labor jobs. For questions 7 to 9, the attribution includes two key clues. Seneca Falls Convention and the year 1848. Even if you don't remember exactly what the Seneca Falls Convention was, don't panic. Just look at the context clue, especially the answer choices for question 7, and you'll see they all focus on woman's issue. Question 7. The key phrase in the question is mostly directly challenge the prevailing ideal. In other words, you're looking for the answer that best reflects what society expected of woman at the time, the traditional norm that excerpt is pushing back against. Choice A, which says woman should enjoy full and equal rights with man, is tempting, but that's actually what the document is arguing for, not what is challenging. Choice B is correct because it reflects the actual prevailing ideal in the early 19th century that women should focus on the home and the domestic sphere. The relationship between A and B is an example of what I mean by finding answer choices that sounds like opposites. Question 8. This one asks about a development in the second half of the 19th century that continued the idea of expressed in the Declaration. So think, what happened after 1865, the end of Civil War, right? That period saw the rise of industrialization, economic inequality, and eventually organized reform movements like those in the Progressive Era. Many women, inspired by the Seneca Fall Convention, began forming voluntary organizations to fight for reform, including suffrage, labor rights, and education. That's exactly what choice A is describing with the phrase the formation of voluntary organizations and reform efforts. The other options describe separate movements, social gospel, outlawing the production and sales of alcohol, and religious revivals that weren't direct continuation of the push for women's political and legal rights. Question 9. This one is all about historical timing. Something was happening by the 1870s, which is after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. Choice B, supporters of Southern secession and states' rights, relates more to before and during the Civil War, so eliminated. Choice D, isolationist, deals with foreign policy, which has nothing to do with the women's rights debate. That leaves choice A
Social
and
Darwinism.
C, supporters of the 15th Amendment. Here's the context. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, but not women. Many women's rights advocates, especially alleged Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, felt betrayed when the former allies in the abolitionist movement supported the amendment without insisting on women's suffrage as well. That led to a split in the reform movement. So if you get C, thinking that 15th Amendment has something to do with the post-Civil War politics because you knew the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. You're absolutely right. Questions 10 to 11 are perfect example of how the attribution provides everything you need to answer the question, since it clearly says Declaration of Independence, 1776. Question 10. What was the reason for Declaration of Independence? Well, the American colonists didn't like being told to pay extra taxes, especially without having any say in the matter. So it's pretty clear that A is the correct choice, with a phrase like British government's attempt to assert greater control. You could also think of this way to see why A makes perfect sense. People seek independence when they want to escape greater control being imposed on them, kind of like a typical relationship between teenagers and their parents. Question 11. You should also remember the famous line, all men are created equal, whenever you are dealing with the Declaration of Independence. This idea was deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, which is why D is the correct answer. Questions 12 to 14 are another great example of how everything you need to answer the question is right there in the attribution, which says Brown versus Board of Education. This landmark case is often taught as early as elementary school. It marked the beginning of the end of segregation, and it was a major step toward achieving racial equality for African Americans. Question 12. It's pretty clear that D is the correct answer because it's the only option that directly discusses segregation, which is exactly what Brown versus Board of Education was about. Southern states responded by shutting down public schools to resist integration. That was the most immediate result of the decision. Question 13. At first glance, all of the choices might seem possible for the question about a growing belief in regard to what the power of the federal government should be used to. But remember, Brown was specifically about ending racial segregation in public school. So the correct answer has to relate to race. That's why A is the correct choice. It's the only one that focuses on promoting greater racial justice. Question 14. Don't get intimidated by all the famous Supreme Court cases listed here. They're important, but you just need to stay focused. For this question, you're looking for the case that the Brown decision reversed. So look for ones that deals with segregation. That makes D the correct answer since Plessy versus Ferguson established a separate but equal doctrine endorsing racial segregation laws, which Brown struck down in 1954. Question 15 and 16 also give you a very important clue in the attribution. You should focus on the phrase illegal aliens. Question 15. What does the term illegal alien suggest and how does it connect to Immigration Act of 1924? Even if you don't know much about the 1920s, you can recognize that illegal alien is a highly emotionally charged term, often tied to fear, exclusion, and discrimination, even in today's society. That alone hints at social tension, making D the correct answer. You can also eliminate A and C. A. Scientific modernism versus religious fundamentalism, and national culture shaped by arts and media don't really connect to immigration policies. Moreover, since the question is about the Immigration Act of 1924, the phrase in the 1920s in choice A and C are more as distractor than helpful clues. A correct answer will be worded like choice D, which mentioned First World War, an event that ended in 1919, fits nicely into the time frame the question is asking about. Some of you might have been tempted by C, thinking national culture meant nationalistic culture, but there is a key distinction. National culture can be neutral or inclusive, while nationalistic culture tends to be ideological and exclusive, which is what the Immigration Act was really about. Lastly, B refers to the Great Migration, a domestic issue involving African Americans, not immigrants from other countries. Question 16. Believe it or not, question 15 gives you a huge clue for answering question 16, which asks you to find the choice that best supports Guy's argument. Once you know the topic is Immigration Act of 1924 and its impact on immigrants labeled as illegal alien, you can already narrow down your options even before reading the full excerpt. With that in mind, you can eliminate C and D because phrases like the diplomatic correspondence, foreign policy, and the great migration of African Americans are not about immigration at all. B might seem plausible because it mentioned immigrant, but it focused on narratives of family life, not broader trend or policies? A is the best answer because it refers to census data showing the changing percentages of the foreign-born population, implying that the number would have decreased. That directly supports Guy's argument that the 1924 law institutionalized racial exclusion in immigration policy. Also, the excerpt includes the line, it codified the principle of racial exclusion, so any evidence showing changes in who was allowed into the U.S. would back that up. That makes a correct choice. Questions 17 to 18 can be answered pretty easily if you pay attention to the year mentioned in the attribution, 1947. Honestly, you don't even need to know all the details of Truman Doctrine to get this right. Question 17. Remember what I said about how the US focused on stopping the spread of communism after 1945, which led to the Cold War? If that's in your mind, you should recognize right away that A is the correct answer. The Truman Doctrine was part of the larger U.S. effort to contain communism around the world, which is what restraining communists means in A. Question 18. Again, D is the correct answer, and here's why. It's the only option that talks about preventing the spread of communism, specifically by supporting non-communist nations. Why would the US want to do that? To stop communist influence from spreading and taking over more countries, especially in Europe and developing world. Now, some of you might have hesitated to choose D because you don't know what bolster meant. But here's a tip you don't normally hear. So next time, if you see so-called SAT word in a otherwise logical answer choice, don't be scared off by it. In fact, it might be a clue that you are on the right track. If an answer choice use a word like bolster instead of something simpler like support or help, it's often intentional. More test takers were likely to get the question right if simpler language were used, so the test writers sometimes include more advanced vocabulary to make the correct answer seem intimidating or less obvious. Questions 19 to 21 also require you to notice a key clue in the description. 19th century photograph. This image clearly shows four men crammed into a small, overcrowded living space, looking disheveled and exhausted. Now think back to two major themes after 1865, the Gilded Age, extreme wealth and poverty side by side, and the Progressive Era, reform efforts to fix problems caused by industrialization and urbanization. Question 19. Which choice do you think relates the condition mentioned in the question? As soon as you read the answer choices, you should notice B because it mentioned progressive reform activity. Given that the image was taken by Jacob Riis, who used photographs to expose the harsh condition of urban poverty, the progressive movement is a clear context here. Reformers like Riis wanted the public and government to take action, so B is the correct answer. Question 20. If you remember that Gilded Age created a handful of mega wealthy individuals while millions live in poverty, then A becomes an easy choice. The photo itself is a visual depiction of that contrast. It screens poverty, overcrowding, and poor living conditions. So the correct answer is A. Question 21. Here's where it helps to understand exactly what the question is asking. Advocates for individuals, such as those shown in the image, means people who wanted to help the poor, like Jacob Riis and other social reformers. what would those advocates have supported? They would have pushed for government intervention to improve conditions for the poor, housing laws, labor protection, sanitation reform, and etc. That's exactly what D is saying. Government should act to eliminate the worst abuse of industrial society. It also helps to recognize that B represents the opposite viewpoint that capitalism without government regulation would naturally improve social condition. Reformers will strongly disagree with that idea, which is why D is the correct choice. Question 22 and 23 can actually be answered even without reading a single word from stimulus. If you know how to use the historical context, at first the attribution might not seem helpful. I mean, I had never heard of John Muir either, even though history was my major and reading about US history is my hobby. But the date, 1909, tells us he was writing during the Progressive Era, and that gives us a big clue. Question 22. The question asks about a major change in Americans' views of the natural environment. Even if you didn't read the excerpt, you could still figure out the answer for two reasons. First, preserve wilderness area in a natural state is an obvious and sensible course of action. It's something most people would support, especially when natural beauty is at risk. Second, the Progressive Era, which includes 1909, was a time when the government took a much more active role in solving social problems and regulating industry. That's why C is clearly the correct answer choice. Also, think back to D in question 21, which said government should act to eliminate the worst abuse of industrial society. If you view the Progressive Era as a time when the government started stepping in to undo the damage caused by industrialization, then C makes the perfect sense. Question 23. Now, if you connect your thinking from question 22 to 23, the right answer becomes even clearer. Why would someone like Muir be calling for government protection of nature? Because the land was being exploited by companies, cities, and industries. That's exactly what A is saying. Increasing usage of exploitation of Western landscape. If you're able to recognize a connection between 22C's preserved wilderness area and question 23A's exploitation of Western landscapes, I'm confident you will be able to spot similar connections when you take the real exam. Questions 24 to 27 require to read a few key lines from the stimulus, especially to answer question 25 and 27. But honestly, if you've done well on the previous questions, you could afford to miss up to 3 questions and still be on track for a score of 5. One helpful piece of information comes from the attribution. George Washington gave this speech in 1796, roughly 20 years after the Declaration of Independence, meaning the US was still a young republic figuring out its place in the world. Question 24. Even if you weren't sure of your initial choice, once you read United States foreign policy decision in question 25, you realize that your answer needs to relate to that idea. From there, you can use the process of elimination to rule out the following choices. A can be eliminated because it's about domestic relations with American Indian tribes. B is also unlikely. Annexing Canada was never seriously considered in U.S. history. D involves Great Britain's treatment of American loyalists who had sided with the British around 1776. But by 1796, that concern was long past. That leaves C, which is the only answer about a real foreign policy debate, whether or not to support revolutionary government of France. That was a hot button issue in the 1790s, and Washington's address directly responded to it. Question 25. This is one of the few questions in which you really do need to read the stimulus. Check out this line. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nation is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. That sentence makes it clear. Washington was warning the U.S. not to get entangled in other nations' political conflicts. That's why C is the correct answer. The U.S. refusal to join the League of Nations in 1919, largely due to a desire to stay out of foreign entanglements, exactly what Washington warned against. Also, notice B, which refers to forming NATO, is the opposite of Washington's advice. The U.S. actively entered into a political and military alliance, ignoring its warning. Question 26. This is arguably the most difficult question in the set. Reading the stimulus won't directly help. You need to understand U.S. political divisions at the time. Since the passage is about foreign policy, you can reasonably eliminate B and C because merchants and plantation owners would be less concerned with foreign policies than political parties. That leaves A, the Democratic Republicans, and D, Federalists. The correct answer is A, because the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, wanted the U.S. to support France in its revolution and war with Britain. They strongly opposed Washington's point of view of neutrality. The Federalists, on the other hand, agreed with Washington and generally favored neutrality and closer ties with Britain. Question 27. If you pick C for question 25 and read the relevant part of the stimulus, you remember Washington said that U.S. should avoid unnecessary involvement in foreign affairs. So now this question is basically asking, when did the U.S. most clearly go against that advice? The best answer is D, involvement in the Second World War. After World War II, the U.S. became a global leader, joined the United Nations, helped form NATO, and took on a permanent role in world affairs. That clearly marked the recommendation of Washington's address ceased to have a significant influence on United States foreign policy. While C, with support for the League of Nations and the U.S. involvement in the First World War is plausible, the U.S. ultimately rejected the League, so Washington's advice still held influence at that time. Therefore, you can eliminate C. You can also eliminate A because westward expansion in the 19th century isn't about U.S. foreign policy. And B because support for Cuban revolutionaries is likely too minor to be seriously considered. Questions 28 to 30 include one that genuinely requires reading the stimulus since the attribution doesn't provide much help. But what about the other two? You can absolutely answer them if you know how to use the clues already built into the questions and answer choices. Question 28. It's important to understand exactly what the question is asking. How did the export of New World crafts change the old world? It's pretty straightforward. If Europe receives more food from the New World, you will benefit from having more to eat. That leads directly to A, which says improving diets and thereby stimulating population growth. Meanwhile, B, C, and D do not focus on the main idea of New World exports affecting the Old World, so they can be eliminated. Question 29. This is one question in which you do need to read the stimulus. Look for the line: the colonists also inadvertently carry pathogens, weeds, and rats. That clearly shows European unintentionally brought disease with them, which devastated Native Americans' populations. So the correct answer is B, the population decline in Native American societies. Question 30. To answer this efficiently, start by recognizing the phrase, the Atlantic world. What does that mean? It's a historical term that refers to the networks and interaction along Europe, Africa, and Americas from the 15th to the 19th centuries, including trade, migration, and cultural exchange. If you understood that, then C, the phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange, should have stood out right away. Even if you didn't know what Atlantic world means, you could still work backward from question 28, which talks about new world crops affecting the old world, a central feature of Columbian exchange. Once again, be wary of choices like A and D that use distractors such as Atlantic or the transatlantic, since the question is specifically about the Atlantic world. In other words, if A and D are the correct answer, it would be too easy. Questions 31 to 34. Once again, paying attention to the title of the map, British settlement of the 13th colonies, 1700 to 1775, is incredibly helpful for answering these questions correctly. The map is clearly about settlement in the colonies, and you can see the shading moving inland over time. Question 31. If the previous two question sets felt a bit challenging, you're probably relieved to see a more straightforward one here. If you remember what I said about the map shows the colonies expanding inland over time, it's clear that A, inland expansion of colonial population, is the correct answer. Meanwhile, B, industrialization, C, American Indian resistance, and D's decline of tobacco production are unrelated to settlement patterns and can be confidently eliminated. Question 32. The correct answer is C. The orientation of the British colonies toward producing commodities for export to Europe. Why? Because before 1700, most British settlers hugged the Atlantic Ocean. This reflects the early colonial economy, which focused on producing cash crops and raw materials like tobacco, rice, indigo, and timber for export to Europe. Settling near ports and shipping routes made economic sense. Exports were the priority. This question is definitely tougher and requires a solid grasp of colonial American history and economic motivations. Question 33. The correct answer is B. An increase in conflicts between British settlers and American Indians. It's obvious from the map that settlers were pushing inland into area where Native American population already lived. This inevitably led to increased conflict as seen in historical events like Pontiac Rebellion and many frontier skirmishes. Also, A and D aren't really about settlement patterns, so they can be eliminated. C is clearly incorrect since a decrease in the economic importance of slavery is far from the truth. Slavery was actually a major source of tension between the North and South throughout the 1800s. Question 34. This is best approached through process of elimination. A is more relevant economic difference in the mid 1800s, not the 1700s. B, colonists' difficulty in effectively resisting the British military. And C, significant portion of colonists who remain loyal to Great Britain are about challenges in the American Revolution, but they don't directly relate to settlement patterns. That leaves D, growth of social tension between backcountry settlers and coastal elites. Why is D correct? As settlers moved into the backcountry, they became more economically and politically isolated from the wealthy elites along the Atlantic coast. This geographic divide led to tensions over representation, taxes, and priorities, which will flare up in events like Bacon's Rebellion and the Regulator Movement. Even if D didn't seem obvious at first, it's only answer that truly fits the consequence of westward expansion during this time. Questions 35 to 37 require to connect the dots between the questions, the time period, and the correct answers. If you can do that, you don't even need to read full stimulus or know much about John C. Calhoun himself. Just pay attention to the year in the attribution, 1844. That's almost 20 years before the Civil War ended in 1865. So it's very likely Calhoun is addressing the rising tension between the North and the South over slavery. And if you glance at the excerpt, Calhoun is clearly defending slavery, claiming that enslaved the Negro race had reached a high level of morals, intelligence, or civilization. Question 35. Even if you don't know who Calhoun is, the attribution helps you narrow down your choices. You can focus on C, Southern landowners, D, Northern industrialists, because they can be considered opposites. Given that Calhoun is defending slavery, it's clear that C is the correct answer. Southern landowners were the group that benefited most from slavery and would have supported the argument that slavery was a positive good. Question 36. The key here is to carefully read the question, especially the phrase, directly undermine Calhoun's assertion. Your task is to find the answer that weakens Calhoun's positive portrayal of slavery. That leads you to B. Many slaves engage in forms of resistance to slavery. If enslaved people were truly as content and uplifted as Calhoun claimed, there would have been no reason for resistance. The fact that many resisted through rebellion, escape, and everyday defiance contradicts his argument directly. Moreover, C. Abolitionist society encountered difficulty organizing in southern states could also be interpreted as the opposite of what B says, because it suggests that slavery was firmly established in the South. Question 37. This one should be clear just from the year mentioned in the attribution, 1944. By that time, the country was already deep in sectional conflict with slavery at the heart of the divide. The correct answer is B. Increased sectional divisions between the North and the South. Calhoun's defense of slavery contributed to the growing divide as the South dug in to protect the institution while the North increasingly opposed its expansion. This kind of argument helped push the nation toward the Civil War. You could arrive at the correct choice B by eliminating A and D since they are not about the issue at hand, which is slavery. C can also be eliminated because the development of sharecropping and tenant farming in the South described conditions after 1865, meaning after the Civil War had ended. Questions 38 to 40 require to actually read the stimulus. Yeah, I know. It's not the most fun part of the test, but sometimes it's necessary. Question 38. This question asks you about what excerpt suggests about the migration. So think, why would people leave their home to settle in a completely unfamiliar place? In most cases, it's because they are hoping for a better life. And that's exactly what A is saying. Workers to achieve social mobility and economic opportunity. You can confirm that by quoting directly from the stimulus, hereby their labor may live exceedingly well. That clearly supports the idea that Smith is pitching the colonies as a place where people can improve their lives through hard work. Question 39. Even though John Smith says, my purpose is not to persuade at the start, his entire excerpt does exactly that. He's trying to convince poor and underemployed English people, like fatherless children and young married couple, to migrate and work in the New World. So the correct answer is C, the role that appeals and advertising played in encouraging men and women to participate in colonization efforts. This is a classic example of colonial propaganda. Question 40. This one requires a little background knowledge from your AP US history class. The New England colonies built economies on small scale farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The colonies of France, especially in Canada, focused more on fur trading and had limited agriculture. That's why A is the correct choice. The New England colonies were based on more diverse agriculture and commerce. Even if you weren't totally sure, you could still eliminate B and C because they focus mostly on the French, while the stimulus is clearly about the New England, as shown in the attribution. Eliminate D because it's too early for any meaningful racial hierarchy to develop in either region. Both were mostly settled by Europeans at this point. Questions 41 to 43 are great examples of how you can often answer questions just by focusing on the attribution without reading a single line of the stimulus. You don't need to know who Carl Schulz was as long as you note that the attribution mentions reports on the condition of the South in 1865. That tells you immediately this is about what happened after Civil War, during the early stages of Reconstruction. Question 41. You can eliminate B because the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln was announced in 1863, not 1865. D can also be eliminated because it's about federal legislative power, which isn't specific to post-war Southern issues. A might sound plausible since it mentions the South, but industrialization of the South wasn't the top concern in 1865. The immediate focus on political and social reintegration. That makes C the correct answer. The process of readmitting Confederate states. Whatever Schultz was observing, it would have been tied to the broader debate over how and under what condition the Southern states would be allowed to join the Union. Question 42. By using the process of elimination and removing choices that don't describe the attitude of white Southerners in the last quarter of the 19th century, you can confidently land on B. A is incorrect because the sale of most plantations to African Americans never happened. Ideally, it might have, but instead, many free people end up working as sharecroppers on land owned by former enslavers. C refers to the nullification crisis which occurred decades earlier in the 1830s. D is easily eliminated because the weak party had already dissolved by the time of the Civil War. So the correct answer is B, the establishment of sharecropping throughout the South. This system was direct result of white Southern attitude and refusal to offer land to free people. Question 43. Once again, just think about what was happening after the Civil War. The Republican Party tried to push Reconstruction reforms but faced hostile resistance in the South. Only one choice reflects that historical reality. C. Republicans grew wary of pressing their Reconstruction agenda in a hostile environment. By the 1870s, many Republicans gave up trying to transform Southern society, especially as violence increased and Northern public support declined. This ultimately led to the end of Reconstruction in 1877. Questions 44 to 46 can actually be solved without reading the entire stimulus as long as you take the note of the year 1937 mentioned in the attribution that tells you Roosevelt's speech came just before World War II, during the time when tensions were rising globally. Of course, if you read the first sentence of the excerpt, it becomes even easier to identify the correct answers. It clearly points toward a shift away from isolationism. Question 44. This question becomes much easier if you notice that A and B express opposite ideas. A argues for expanding U.S. involvement in world affairs. B argues for avoiding entanglement, classic isolationism. At the time, most Americans favored isolationism since the country was still recovering from Great Depression and wanted to stay out of foreign conflicts. So when the question asks you to identify what differ from prevailing U.S. foreign policy, the correct answer is A, arguing to expand the role of the United States in the world. Question 45. If you chose A for question 44, you're in a great position to recognize that D follows directly from it. Roosevelt was trying to move the country away from isolationism and prepare the public for eventual involvement in World War II. That's why D is the correct answer. Overcome oppositions to participation in the impending Second World War. You can also get to the correct answer through elimination. A. Treaty of Versailles is about World War I and long outdated by 1937. B. The acquisition of new territories abroad doesn't align with Roosevelt's message or the U.S. position during the Depression. C. Contain the spread of communism is a Cold War concern that comes after World War II. Question 46. This is the most challenging of the three because all the options seem reasonable at first glance. But if you go back to what Roosevelt was emphasizing, international cooperation, treaty enforcement, and collective responsibility by saying the peace-loving nation must make a concerted effort in opposition to those violation of treaties, then B is the best answer. United States membership in an international collective security organization. After World War II, the U.S. helped establish the United Nations in 1945 and took a lead role in maintaining international peace. Exactly the kind of global engagement Roosevelt called for in his speech. Why not the others? A refers to internal Cold War tension, not collective international efforts. C is related to containment, but it reflects a military strategy, not the diplomatic and moral tone of Roosevelt's speech. D, which basically describes peace movement, reflects oppositions to U.S. global engagement, not continuity with Roosevelt's ideas. Questions 47 to 49. As long as you understand that the poster shows men going off to fight fascism in Europe, in Asia and women staying behind to work in factories, you can breeze through these questions with confidence. Question 47. A is correct choice because the poster is direct reflection of wartime mobilization. It was part of a larger effort to rally civilian support, especially from women, to keep the country running and supply the military with the materials it needed. B, because US become a leading world power after the war. C, because the focus here is industrial production, not the consumer goods. D, can be eliminated because the poster is meant to mobilize civilians, not restrict civil liberties, though restrictions like Japanese internment certainly did occur. Question 48. This one's about the purpose of poster. You can eliminate B and C because they aren't specific to World War II and don't reflect the tone of the poster. A might be plausible at first, but if you look again, the intention of the poster wasn't to persuade women to enlist in the military, it was to encourage women to support the work from home. That leaves D as the correct answer. The poster is meant to convince women that they had an essential role in the war effort. Question 49. A is the correct answer because the poster shows a temporary redefinition of women's role, from homemakers to skilled laborers in factories. This shift during World War II helped pave the way for feminist movement of 1970s, in which women began to demand equal economic opportunities, all inspired in part by their contribution during the war. You can eliminate B because it focuses on anti-war effort, not gender equality. C because World War II shows that women could take industrial jobs. Manufacturing wasn't failing to create opportunities. D because it refers to conservative backlash in later decades, not a continuation of progress the poster represents. Questions 50 to 51. These questions require you to at least read the first sentence of the stimulus because the attribution alone, President Clinton radio address to the nation 1996, doesn't give you enough context to answer confidently. Question 50. B is the correct choice because the excerpt begins with the era of big government is over, but we can go back to a time when our citizens were just left to fend for themselves. This signals a shift away from the New Deal and Great Society era government expansion, suggesting that while government support would still exist, individuals would now be expected to take more responsibility for their own welfare. This is exactly what Clinton's 1996 welfare reform aimed to do: restrict benefits and encourage self reliance. That's why B is the best match. You can eliminate A and C because both refer to foreign policies or trade, not the domestic focus of the excerpt. D because enacting universal health care will expand the government's role, opposite of what Clinton is calling for here. Question 51. While the excerpt is about reducing the size of government, Clinton also emphasized not abandoning people entirely, a centralist position. The process of elimination, you'll find that B, Ronald Reagan, is the best fit. A. Lyndon Johnson and C. Franklin Roosevelt both greatly expanded government through the Great Society and New Deal, respectively. D. Woodrow Wilson, who was president before the Great Depression, and his policies were less relevant to debate about the modern welfare state. Clinton's message, scaling back government while keeping a safety net, most closely echoes Reagan's philosophy. of limited government paired with personal responsibility, making B the correct answer. Questions 52 to 55 can be solved effectively if you analyze the attribution room and spindle, or life among early mill girls describing events in the 1830s. This tells you the stimulus is about young women working in textile mills in the 1830s, which place it at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Question 52. You can arrive at the correct choice C by using the process of elimination. A. Republican motherhood refers to raising virtuous citizens at home, not industrial labor. B. Large-scale immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe didn't happen until the late 1800s, long after the 1830s. D. The wartime need for women to fill jobs refers to World War II over a century later. That leaves C, the expansion and increased organization of industrial production, which directly describe what was happening in places like Lowell, Massachusetts during this period. Question 53. The only choice that directly addresses the reality of young women working in the factories to produce goods for broader market is A. The sharp increase in the number of workers making goods for distant markets. This was a defining feature of market revolution, which reshaped the American economy in the first half of the 1800s. B, C, and D either don't match the economic focus or apply more to middle class domestic life than to factory labor. Question 54. Remember the big picture pattern we discussed. If the time period is closer to 1776, questions are usually about the federal government. If it's closer to 1865, they often deal with tensions between North and South, particularly around slavery. If the question asks you about a major difference in economic development between the Northeast and the South in the first half of the 1800s, it's obvious that C is the correct answer. The South relied much less on wage labor than the Northeast. That's because the Southern economy was based on slave labor, while the Northern economy, especially in textile mills like Lowell, relied on paid workers, including many young women. As for A, B, and D, they are all historically inaccurate or don't describe key regional economic difference of the time. Question 55. This question focuses on the second half of the 19th century, meaning after the Civil War. Since the stimulus was about young women working in factories, it makes sense that the follow-up will involve changing labor conditions during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. The correct answer is D. Confrontations between unions and factory management over wages and working conditions that directly challenges Robinson's assertion that she and other mill workers were well off. By the late 1800s, industrial labor had become more exploitative, leading to the rise of labor union and organized protests over long hours, long wages, and dangerous conditions. Okay, that's the end of the test and this video. Thank you for watching and good luck on the actual exam.